Hey everyone, thought I'd get out again now that autumn's hit. It's actually quite sad seeing the bracken turning brown because it didn't seem that long ago it was sprouting up, because that's something that I always look out for. So I always feel like the bracken sprouting up is kind of the first signs of summer, and it really doesn't seem that long ago that that was happening, and now it's autumn already. This year's just gone so quick. Thought to get another couple of camp outs done, and I do like to do a Halloween camp. I haven't done one for a couple of years, but brought a book with me, so I'm going to read some horror stories over the fire later on. I've actually brought my 3-man tent out with me today because even though the solo tent's good in the summer when all I'm going to be doing is sleeping in it, when the weather's getting a bit cooler and when it's getting darker a lot earlier, I really need a tent that I can relax in more. So I like a tent that's a bit bigger, that I can sit up in. I can not quite stand up in that, but I can sit up really comfortably in that 3-man tent. Lots of room to spread out. I can sit there reading or listening to a podcast or whatever after dark. I've got these light up tent pegs. They've just got little electronic lights in them which light up the guy ropes, so that helps me to avoid tripping over them after dark. I've got 2 of them on either side of the tent. And that's those pegs when they're folded up. I've just got a couple of them out of a cheap shop. They only take small little batteries, but I've had them for quite a few years now, so they have lasted me. And then they just kind of fold down at the front there, and you twist them to put them on. And in the tent here I've got this hanging light bulb, just battery powered, but that's really handy actually for lighting up the tent as well. So you can see how much space I've got in there. Like I say, this is designed for 3 men, but I'd say 2, and you pack. It's a pretty huge tent. The only problem with it is that it is very big and cumbersome to carry around. That's why I don't use it much, because it takes up a lot of space in the pack. It doesn't pack down particularly compact. There is actually quite a bit of moonlight tonight, but it's still too dark for me to really capture it on the camera, so I'm having to use the torch. The microphone's picking that up, but there's an owl hooting in the background. Hopefully you heard that, because that helps to kind of set a nice spooky tone for the evening. It's only going to be a quick video. Sort to come out here. I'm going to have a quick night out, but I've only brought like 1 meal with me, and just going to have a very simple camp out just to relax. But there it is again. But yeah, I just wanted to get out and do something for Halloween. I hope the mic's picking that up. The owl's really hooting. It's a really great night for it. There's a almost full moon, really bright moon. Owls hooting in the background. Great night for a spooky campfire ghost story. I'm going to read a couple of stories from this True Monster Stories book by Terry Deary, who's better known for doing horrible histories, I think. And I've had this book since I was a kid. They're just kind of short, creepy stories, nothing too horrific. But I've always really enjoyed these books. I never read horrible histories or whatever, but his True Stories series I thought was really good. They did true monster stories, true ghost stories, true horror stories, true UFO stories. There was a whole series of them, and they're all stories that are based on true accounts by people over the years of different kind of supernatural or horrific situations and creatures. First up, I've got a werewolf tale. Professor Richard Eldon was pleased with himself. He stood at the door of the mountain cottage and breathed the clean Merionshire air. "Wonderful, Averil," he cried to his wife. "Didn't I tell you I'd give you the best holiday you've ever had?" Avril Eldon had spent an hour unpacking their cases. She had lit the fire in the stove and begun to cook an evening meal. Her husband had spent that hour on the porch of the cottage, smoking his pipe and staring out at the mountains, shimmering in the sun. Wonderful view, and so peaceful. Nothing can disturb us here. We really can relax. The woman staggered into the cottage with an armful of logs and said pointedly, "Can you, dear?" Her husband didn't seem to notice the edge in her voice. "Yes, we can walk up those mountains tomorrow," he promised. Avril pushed a wisp of her hair from her brow and winced. "Oh, good," she said flatly. "First you could help me make the beds. The linen's in the cupboard and it needs taking out now. It'll have to be aired before we sleep in it tonight." The professor pulled a large watch out of his waistcoat pocket. If I'm going to get any fishing in today, I'll have to set off now." He sighed and turned to pick up his fishing basket. "You'll manage." His wife opened her mouth to object, but he went on. "That seems fair enough to me. You make the beds while I catch our supper. I'll be back before sunset," he promised as he marched down the hillside. The professor returned at sunset just as he'd promised, but without the fish he said he'd bring. "Sorry, my love," he sighed. "There don't seem to be any fish in that lake. Or if there are, then something's scaring them away." "Just as well I made a shepherd's pie then," his wife sniffed. He dropped his fishing basket on the white tablecloth and Avril reached forward quickly to lift it off. "That's clean," she cried. Then feeling the weight of the basket, she added, "Well, he must have caught something." The professor blinked. "What?" "Oh yes, almost forgot. I found a fascinating thing down by the lake. The most unusual..." He opened the wicker basket and took out a huge skull. Avril wasn't usually upset at the sight of bones, but something about the skull disgusted her. "What on earth is it?" Her husband shrugged. "Thought we'd take it back to the college at the end of the holiday. One of the chaps in the science department might tell us. It's not sheep, too big. And those huge teeth belong to a meat eater," his wife added. "Some sort of dog?" "Never seen a dog that big." "That's why it's so exciting. I thought it could be prehistoric," the man said proudly. "Just pop it on the shelf for now. We'll look at it again at supper time." But after supper the professor had other plans. "The pub?" his wife groaned. "You going to the pub down the village and leaving me here all alone?" The man shrugged. "Tore my trousers on some bushes down by the lake. Thought you could darn them for me. It'll keep you occupied. See you later. Shouldn't be more than a couple of hours," he promised as he vanished through the door. Avril Eldon lit one of the oil lamps in the cottage and took out her sewing basket. As she bent over her mending, she noticed that the room was growing brighter. Looking up, she saw the moon rising over the mountains and flooding through the window. The mountains were black, desert and silent. A soft snuffling sound was the first hint that she was not alone. She looked up sharply, the empty eyes of the skull staring down at her from the shelf. Then there was a sharp scraping at the door as if some dog was asking to come in. Avril put down her needling and walked over to check that the door was fastened tight. There was a small window beside the door. As she reached it, a shadow blotted out of the moonlight. The huge face of an enormous dog was peering at her with great glowing eyes. The eyes were fixed on her, willing her to open the door, but she knew she had to fight them and forced her own eyes shut, blindly finding the beam that barred the door. She leaned with her back to the door and saw those eyes in her mind, intelligent eyes, human eyes, and weren't those paws on the sill more like human hands? Suddenly she remembered the front door. Racing through the house, she reached the bolts just as the latch rattled. She heard the creature panting hungrily. It snarled when the door refused to give and growled as it walked around the house looking for another way in. The woman sank, trembling, to the floor and pressed her back to the door, her legs too weak to move. Time and again the beast barged and bumped against the door. Then Avril did something she hadn't done for years. She prayed. She said every prayer she could remember from her days in Sunday school and a few that she made up on the spot. When she stopped mumbling the Lord's Prayer for the last time, she was surprised to find that the noises had gone. She rose weakly to her feet and laughed at her own nervous state. "Just a dog," she muttered. "Just a dog." Then she froze as the gravel outside the door rattled and the latch clattered. Thump, 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 the door shook. Then a voice, a human voice, a voice she hardly recognised, "Avril, open the door, woman! Avril!" Her trembling hands pulled back the bolts and tugged the door open. She dragged her husband inside and quickly locked them again. The professor blinked. "What's wrong, my dear? You look as if you've seen a ghost." Avril shook her head slowly. "No, something much worse than any ghost." She told her husband about the ghastly visitor. Professor Eldon frowned. "That ties up with something the villagers told me down the pub. Some story about the lake being haunted by a man-wolf." "What was it they called it?" "Yes, a werewolf." "Just as well I came prepared for some shooting," he said grimly as he slid a rifle out of its leather case. He checked that it was loaded and sat at the table staring out into the night. Hours passed. The couple kept up their unblinking watch. Then as the moon sank, and even as the owls had returned to their nests, the face of the wolf with the eyes of a man appeared at the window. Professor Eldon snatched his gun and ran to the door. The wolf saw the movement and fled ahead of him. Even in the darkness of that mountain night, the creature had its own greenish, ghoulish glow. The man followed the beast down the path to the lake. The werewolf stopped at the edge of the lake, turning and looked back with its hot coal eyes as the professor raised the rifle to fire. The creature howled and plunged itself into the lake. But as it hit the water, it disappeared without a splash, without a ripple. The man staggered with exhaustion towards the cottage. His wife was standing behind him. In her hands, she held the ivory skull. Without a word, he nodded, took it from her hands, and walked to the edge of the water. He threw it as far into the lake as he could. Putting his arm around his wife's shoulder, he walked back to the cottage. The sunrise came, and the werewolf was never seen again. Peace returned to the lake. Peace never returned to the Eldons. The monster lived on in their minds and troubled their thoughts forever after. Now for a true vampire tale as recounted by a policeman. I've been in the police force a long time now. In all those years I've seen some strange things, met some strange people. But the strangest thing, and the strangest person, was the case of the man who was killed by a vampire. It's true, in a way. It happened back in January 1973. I was a young detective constable at the time, on duty in Stoke-on-Trent, that's in the English Midlands. Sounded like a routine case. I was sent to a number 3, the Villas. The neighbours had reported that a 70-year-old man had not been seen for a few days. Nothing strange about that. People often go missing. Usually we find them alive. Miss Ledger at number 2 was a worried woman. "You reported your neighbour missing?" I said, as she answered the door. She nodded. I took out my notebook. "Mr. Missoura," she said. Could you spell that?" I asked. "No, can't you?" she replied. I sighed. I made a guess at the spelling. "Funny name." "Polish," she explained. "And what makes you think he's missing?" She shrugged herself into a worn old cardigan. "Milk bottle's on the doorstep. I always say him to say hello in the morning, and I haven't seen him for a few days." "That's Wednesday," I noted. "Have you knocked at his door?" "This afternoon," she said carefully. Her small eyes glittered in the light from the street lamp. "He doesn't like people knocking," she said in a hoarse whisper. "He's scared." "Scared of what?" Miss Ledger leaned forward and her eyes flickered up and down the street. "Scared of things that come for you in the night." I began to put my notebook away. It was clear I was dealing with a crank here. She shot out an arm and with a rough hand stopped me. "No, honest. He came here after the last war with nothing. He ran away from the Germans. They killed his wife and family. Scared him witless, it did." "And he thinks the Germans are still after him?" I asked. She shook her thin head. "No, but he's a nervous man. He's had a hard life, and I wouldn't like to see anything happen to him, poor old bloke." "Poor, lonely old man," she sighed. Miss Ledger looked as if she knew what it was to be poor and lonely. "Don't frighten him, huh?" "I'll try," I promised, and walked the few steps to number 3. I let the heavy iron knocker fall against the door. The knock boomed through the house like a tomb. An empty house with bare walls and floors. I've seen a lot of houses like that in my time. I waited as Miss Ledger shivered in the shadow of her doorway. I tried the door. It was locked. I pushed it with my shoulder and the rotten old wood gave way. Another push and it splintered inwards. I found myself in a dark hallway that smelled of cabbage and old socks. I groped for a light switch, Found a cold metal one and clicked it down. Nothing happened. Miss Ledger's voice came from the doorway. "You won't have electric in the house," she explained. "Too scared." Luckily, I carried a torch. I stepped towards the door on the right of the hall. My feet crunched in something powdery. The torch showed white crystals. Strung along the door were white, withered balls. The door to the room opened with a creak when I pushed it. My torch caught the pale, frightened face of the old man on the bed. He didn't move. Those wild, wide eyes didn't blink in the beam of the torch. I knew he was dead. I closed the door softly and went off to call for assistance. The first tests showed that he had choked to death. Choked on a pickled onion? There had to be an inquiry into his death, an inquest led by a coroner. A sad case, the coroner declared, but people have been known to choke to death on their food before now. He turned to me. "Anything to add, Constable?" I swallowed hard. I could have let the case rest there, but I had decided to take a trip to the local public library before the inquest. Eventually I'd come across a book called The Natural History of the Vampire that seemed to have the answer. That's how I knew what had scared old McClintock to death. I turned to the coroner. "Yes, sir," I said. The coroner looked over the top of his glasses at me. "Well?" I took a deep breath. There was a white crystals scattered all over his floor and over his bed. The lab report confirms that this was in fact salt. A packet of salt was found on the feet of the deceased. The coroner looked a little blank, but said, "Go on." "The bulbs around the door proved to be garlic," I said. "And what do you deduce from that, Constable?" he asked. "That Mr. McClintock was terribly afraid of vampires," I said. The coroner blinked, and the glasses almost fell off his nose. "Are you suggesting that he died as the result of a vampire attack? There were no marks on the body." "No, sir," I said quickly. "Just that he may have died of the fear of a vampire attack. In Eastern Europe, I believe people are convinced that such creatures exist." The coroner sat back, took off his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. "Very well. We will postpone this case for 2 weeks for further tests." He left a stunned courtroom with some reporters who were scribbling furiously about this ordinary case that had turned out to be a sensation. But I was in the office when the new test results came in. Mr. Mercury had died of choking, but not on a pickled onion. He had choked on one of his own cloves of garlic. The terrified man had slept with one in his mouth to keep away the vampires. As he fell asleep, the garlic slid into his throat and choked him. In a curious way, the vampires got him after all. I wanted to do something for Halloween, because I love Halloween, I love the creepy season, so I thought I'd just read a few slightly creepy stories over the campfire. I thought it'd be fun. And I like doing Halloween videos, but I don't want to repeat myself by just doing the same things that I've done before, me kind of running around the woods and that. So hopefully some of you have enjoyed this, just to kind of relax, listen to some stories. Like I say, I don't know if my narration's all that good, because I'm not used to reading out loud, but it's been a nice night. It's actually really warm out here, especially with the fire going. Really lovely night to be out. Any of you guys love Halloween? I always have a horror movie marathon all through October. I love horror movies, but I try and keep them all now to watch in October, so I've got plenty to occupy me. Thanks for joining me. I'll hopefully be going out in November, because I'm going to have some more free time then, so I can get out and do a proper camp out video. But still, this has been a really nice night out. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll catch you again in a few weeks.